Hi, I'm Woah77, and this is my second Woah's Wednesday. And today, I'm going to talk again about role-playing games. Last week I talked about them. It was well received. Everybody liked the video, I guess. So I'm going to talk again like this. But I'm not going to talk about role-playing games like I did last time, where I talked about video game role-playing games. Now, today I want to talk about the first role-playing games that I played, and that is tabletop role-playing games. I started with Dungeons & Dragons First Edition back in 94-ish. It's been a long time. I could barely read when I first picked up tabletop role-playing games. I didn't actually have the dice initially. We had to go and find the dice, and it took us a while before I could actually play the role-playing games. And I will attribute role-playing games to a lot of aspects of how I think about the world and have learned about the world. And I'd like to talk about role-playing games because, well, they're really diverse. There's a lot of different kinds of role-playing games. Pretty much, if you can think of a fandom, it probably has a role-playing game. If you can think of a genre, probably has a role-playing game. If you can think of a setting, probably has a role-playing game. There's Game of Thrones role-playing games, Wheel of Time role-playing games, Firefly role-playing game, Doctor Who role-playing game, Star Trek, Star Wars. In fact, there's a bunch of Star Wars ones, a couple of Star Trek ones. Role-playing games are very diverse. There's a lot of different kinds of role-playing games. But really, as you play a bunch of them and you look at the rules and how they play, they really end up tending to fall into two categories. You have your mechanical, rules-heavy, realistic role-playing games that are trying to emulate reality with all of these dice rolls. And then you have your cinematic role-playing games, which care a lot more about the story and driving the story forward, and yes, there are skills, and yes, there's combat rules, but those are to propel action, not to simulate reality. And they really fall into these two categories. And for the longest time when I was growing up, I had realistic role-playing games. And I'm not exactly sure that's entirely true, because very early on I had the West End Games Star Wars role-playing game, and that is a little more cinematic. I had the Star Trek role-playing game, that was a little more cinematic, but I wasn't ready for those because I was really young and didn't understand what they were trying to teach for role-playing games at the time that I had those games. Looking back, I can identify that, but this is new. You know, for me, that was a new thing. I hadn't yet learned about how those role-playing games were supposed to be played. So D&D is your classic mechanical role-playing game. It was literally directly descended from war games. War games, for those who don't know, you have a bunch of miniatures on a battlefield, and every turn, these guys move, you do your actions, they shoot at each other, a few of them die, and then you go to the next turn and do the same kind of thing again, and it's a strategic game. And there are more tactical ones where you have small squads, and D&D kind of evolved out of the small squad, grotesque situation type of tactical war game. I believe the fantasy ones in particular. And there's actually a role-playing game book that I had some time ago called Fantasy Wargaming that was kind of published alongside D&D that's really sort of characteristic of this. We're bridging the gap from war games to role-playing games. And it's it was a very, very sort of fluid transition into what is now role-playing games. And you can see it in the rules, how the rules are structured, how the rules are written up. They're very much, even the distance units that they use are inches and feet that were your units of measurement when we were talking about miniatures of certain scales. So all of these things came out of war games. And now we're moving into role-playing games, and it took a while for us to move away from that war game concept, because D&D being, the big name when you think of a role-playing game, still very much mechanics heavy, focused on a war game. Let's roll out the map and set out all our guys, and here's the big creature, and here's their minions, and now I'm gonna position myself over here, and I'm gonna cast a fireball just so, and it's got this radius, so it's gonna hit this guy, this guy, this guy, and that guy, and then we're gonna roll dice, and I'm gonna see how much damage I'm supposed to do, and then they're gonna roll dice and see how much damage they avoid taking. Very much like war games. And those are supposed to be realistic, which, okay, you're riding around on dragons, casting spells, and physics generally doesn't come up unless the DM's just trying to say no. So it's kind of absurd to call anything that most role-playing games cover as realistic. And then you have cinematic role-playing games. And cinematic role-playing games are much closer to you're going to the movies or your TV show. You've got a bunch of people sitting around a table and they talk about something, and this guy goes over to the computer and presses some buttons, and boom, I've hacked into the database, and boom, I have the answers. Now let's go get the guy and matrix dodge his bullets as I shoot the chandelier to bring it down on him, crushing him to death. Very cinematic, happens in a movie style of game. And I haven't really noticed a lot in between these two categories. I mean, there's different levels of complexity of rules, but then there's the cinematic to realistic, and there's not really a mid-ground between we want it to be somewhat mechanically heavy without being D&D, but we don't want it wishy-washy cinematic. It just doesn't really exist. I'd be loved shown wrong. If somebody has a comment of an example of a game that fits that descriptor, share away with me. I'd be happy to talk about that. I'd be happy to look into it. I play a lot of different role-playing games. I mean, I can't even go down the entire list of role-playing games that I've played and have read, and I mean, multiple editions of multiple games. I've played at least 4 editions of D&D. I've played Pathfinder, Star Trek, Star Wars, multiple World of Darkness generations. It's really, it's too many to list. It's not even like a video I would like to do a talk on, because me just listing the RPGs I've played sounds, well, boring. But you have this sort of discrepancy between these systems that are mechanics heavy, where and depending on how you play them, some of them, they either fall on one side or the other. Like I said, there's not really a middle ground, but you could play cinematic BRP or you could play mechanical BRP. Depending on what game master is running, it's going to fall on one side or the other. There's not really a middle ground, but the system itself is flexible enough that you could play it either way. BRP, for those who haven't ever heard of it, is the basic role-playing system. It's used in Call of Cthulhu. A bunch of other games use it. A version of it's used in Eclipse Phase. You may or may not have heard of this. It's a bit of an obscure transhumanist setting. But depending on how you play it, you can either play it hard and fast, where combat is super lethal and you have to make lots of skill checks for everything, and you're rolling percentiles all the time, and it's lots of dice rolling all the time for everything. Or you can play it more cinematic. I make a dice roll to see if I can perform a stunt, and there are modifiers that the GM will add or remove, and if I get close enough to my skill level, I can have marginal success, and if I get way under it, then I have this super cinematic effect, and you can play it either way. It's kind of it's a flexible system. It's really hard to wind that narrow road between them, because you're either going to be compelling people to roll dice a lot or compelling people to roll dice occasionally, and you're not really going to have this balance of dice rolling, because how much dice rolling is too much to be cinematic depends on the circumstance. And generally, you want your rules to be consistent. How many times do I need to roll for what? You want your players to know what's coming. You as the GM want to set expectations, because when you're playing the game in the middle of combat is not the time to change the rules up on people. It makes for a big fight. Everybody gets upset. Lots of hurt feelings. I've seen it at the table many times. Not a good time. Even though we say save your arguments for after the game, I've played in many groups. I can't even begin to count them. And anytime that a rules argument comes up, the save it till after the game is usually forgotten. It occasionally happens, and it's nice when it does, but typically it's, well, like I said, forgotten. Tabletop gamers tend to be very book smart, tend to be very book heavy. So we like to know the rules. We like to read the rules. We like to read the books. We like to know what's in the game, what we're supposed to do, how to play the game, what we're supposed to expect. And so when that changes all of a sudden mid-game, we tend to react less than ideally. So as gamers, as a GM, as a player, I've seen it time and again, and I don't recommend having it be a wishy-washy thing. If you have a game system that has that variable number of rolls for situationally based, share it with me, but I feel as though such a system I would find inconsistent and wouldn't enjoy. But I'm open to look. Then some cinematic systems that I've played that is really great is the World of Darkness series, where you tend to have very simple dice rolls. Sometimes it's a lot of dice, depending on which system again, but you roll a bunch of dice. You're trying to get above a certain number on a certain amount of those dice. If you get enough dice over that number, you succeed. If you get a lot of dice over that number beyond that, then you do exceptionally well, and there are additional effects you can have. If you don't get the number of successes, depending on the situation, you can try to continue the action until you succeed, or it could be competitive. So I'm trying to get so many successes, they're trying to get so many successes, and if I get more successes than them, I succeed. And if I get fewer successes than them, they succeed, usually in combat. So they're trying to dodge, I'm trying to hit them with my sword, or my gun, or whatever weapons. So I rolled a hit, roll 5 successes. They rolled a dodge. If they roll 5 successes or more, they dodge out of the way like a ninja. If they roll 4 successes or fewer, I nail them with my gun. If they roll no successes and I roll 5 successes, then I do a bunch of extra damage because my hit was just that good. It hit them and tore a massive hole in them. And if I only got 1 success more than them, then I got a hit and it connected, but it wasn't a super great hit. It was just an okay hit. You know, I got him with my fist, but I got him in the shoulder, and he's like, oh, and then he goes to swing his battle axe at me and try to chop my head off, and he rolls to hit, and I roll to dodge, and maybe I lose my head. They also have multiple ways of dealing with damage, and sometimes World of Darkness can almost get mechanics heavy. Usually it doesn't. The times when it does is because somebody got really powerful, and so they just have layers upon layers of abilities that apply, rather than it being the process takes so many steps. What it is that they have, you roll to hit, and they roll to dodge, and then after they roll to hit, they roll for damage, and then you roll dice to soak the damage, and then you spend an ability to use one of your other powers to shunt that damage onto this other guy, because you've got magic, and abilities, layers and layers of abilities. Is that good or bad? World of Darkness was a very funny system. It had some very interesting things. I could actually probably talk about World of Darkness for an entire video if people were interested. I've been reading / playing it for 15-ish years? Not quite 15 years. 13? Something like that. A long time. Since I was a teenager and getting close to 30 now. So, a long time I've been reading, paying attention to World of Darkness, keeping up with the various editions. My actual favorite edition of World of Darkness, as far as I know, isn't currently being worked on, although I'd really love to see another set of Dark Ages, a new edition of the Dark Ages stuff, because the Dark Ages setting was my personal favorite. I'm getting way off topic here. Sorry. I almost ran out of direct topic things to say, so I've gone on random tangents. So, mechanics heavy, cinematic heavy. I mean, which style you want. I mean, they're two very different styles of game, and depending on your group of players, determines really which one you want to tend to go for. Because if you've got a bunch of people who want to go and roll dice to kill stuff, a cinematic heavy game is going to feel boring. I rolled 4 successes, he rolled 1, I shot him in the head instead. That was anticlimactic. I just did my thing and he died. Well, that's because the game's focus isn't on the combat. The game's focus is on the story. The combat's only a mechanism for driving forward the story. You maybe want one of the more mechanics-heavy stuff like D&D, where going through an epic combat, getting those lucky dice rolls that got you all the way, it's really rewarding. A couple weeks ago, was it last week? No, it was the week before last. My 2nd edition D&D group, we went and we raided a hag's lair. And the previous couple of weeks, we had gotten them back into their hideout, and they had put up this fog, and they were hiding back in their lair. And we decided, you know what, we're not going to wait out here and come at them again. We've beaten them up a bunch already, so we're going to go, and we're going to take them out. And we went in there, we did a couple of guerrilla tactics, sort of got to the edge of the fog that they had put up around their base, and cast a spell and then backed off real quick, and then cast a spell and then backed off real quick. Well, one of those times, one of our guys got thoroughly entrenched in the combat, so we didn't back off. We went full in, and my character is a bard, which you're laughing right now. I can hear you laughing right. But so my character's a bard. He's the greatest liar which has ever lived. He tells the best lies, the greatest lies, and he plans to one day, lie his way to being king. Well, my character, Lanimer, he's not a combat guy, and because he's a lying bard, he doesn't have the typical bard powers of like inspiring people or putting people to sleep or charming people. No, he tells lies. Really, really good lies. That's what his thing is. he can lie his ass off. He can lie your ass off. He could lie you into giving him the keys to the kingdom. That's his whole plan. Never mind. Anyway, so he's not a particularly combat-y guy, but he does have a couple of spells. He has a, I think it's Thunderlance or something. Lance Shattering? I don't even remember the name of the spell, but it deals a line of force in 60 feet, 60-foot long line of force. So he first, he sneaks in there and he creeps up, finds his opening, casts his line of force, shoots straight down, damages a couple of people pretty good. Might have even killed somebody. Can't remember, but did some serious damage to some people. Awesome. Then he creeps around, casts a Chromatic Orb. Now, for those of you who don't know 2nd edition Chromatic Orb is a spell that, depending on your caster level, has a range of different effects that you can choose. Well, the 9th level one, my bard just happens to be a 9th level caster, happens to be Save or Die. Well, and this is, mind you, a 1st level spell. Pretty much the most broken spell, well, okay. Maybe the most broken 1st level spell in 2nd edition, although I'm not sure that that's the case, and I bet that somebody will be able to watch this and tell me a different spell that's more broken. But most broken spell that my bard has for a 1st level spell, for sure. So he casts the Chromatic Orb. Believe I rolled a 20 to hit. Nails this giant. Big giant. Barely been touched by anybody so far in the combat. And nails him, and he fails the saving throw. Boom, drops dead. The bard just kill-stealed on the party. Then there's the hag, and the hag got charged by a bunch of people, beaten down by a bunch of people. Well, almost dead. Lanimer, you know what? Wild chance. He pulls out a sling, slings a bullet at her, kills her. Yes, the bard kill-stealed the hag with a sling. For those of you who haven't played D&D, you may not understand quite how impressive, pathetic that is, because a sling is, well, a pitiful weapon. I think it does a D3 or a D4 damage and like a D4 or D6 against a large creature, which she happened to count as large, so, I got the D6 damage because it was a bullet, but still. A bow starts at like a D8. Crossbows like a D8, D10. Like, lots of weapons do lots more damage. Slings are bottom tier noob scrub weaponry. Nobody uses slings. It's just not really done. But my bard, not having any other ranged weapons, and being a craven bard who doesn't want to get hurt in combat, he's got his face to keep in shape. Can't let the moneymaker get hurt, So he sling kills the hag. Epic story would not be as epic if it was done in World of Darkness. Just an equivalent scenario done in World of Darkness just isn't as cool. In order for it to be equivalently cool in World of Darkness, the thing that you have to fight is gotta be so much scarier, so much bigger and badder than you. And why it was cool is because you got to walk away. It wasn't because you won, it's because you got to walk away. That's it. World of Darkness is not a game where the killing of something was super awesome. It can be occasionally, rarely, but generally speaking, what's super awesome about World of Darkness is not the kill, but the survival. I got to live another day against horrible forces of evil. That's cool. I beat this thing to a bloody pulp. Well, if I can beat it to a bloody pulp, it wasn't scary enough. It kind of falls into one of two categories. Either it's super scary and I don't win and surviving is why it's awesome, or it's not scary and I walked all over it. Very rarely in World of Darkness you have this, it was a fair fight and we just managed to get through it. It's not a thing. And that's kind of the difference between a mechanically heavy versus a cinematic heavy game. What's cool about the cinematic game is when you figured out the plot and you figured out all the cool things that were going on and you unraveled the mystery and you solved it just before the big bads unleashed their plan and summoned Cthulhu. That's a cinematic plot line right there. You solved the mystery, you foiled it, instead of them getting the holy water that they needed, they got this hydrochloric acid, and so when they tried to summon it, they dumped it on their sacrifice. Instead of it purifying it and allowing Cthulhu to rise up in the vessel, it turned that sacrifice to a bloody pulp, and the psionic backlash killed all the cultists. That's a cinematic ending. The mechanics-heavy ending is by the nick of our teeth, with 3 of us badly broken and beaten to death, or near death. I managed to just barely get the sling bullet off, kill the hag. It just doesn't happen in a cinematic game. That's not how cinematic games are run. Is that a good thing, a bad thing? Again, it depends who your players are. Then the biggest parts of of being a game master, or DM, or a GM, or an ST, or narrator, or whatever your system calls it. I've seen at least 5 or 6 different names for the position, is knowing your players. If you have the players who want to have a grind fest of combat, D&D, it's your game. Pathfinder, it's your game. Hackmaster, it's your there's dozens and dozens and dozens of systems over here. Great for that. If you have a team that likes to involve in a story and unravel the mystery and solve the puzzle and work it out, or here in the cinematic side, dozens and dozens of systems that are just right for your guys. If you don't know which one to play, download one of those demo kits and try each one with your players and see what they like better. Generally speaking, players don't just like combat or just like story. They generally like a mix. There's some happy balance that they like to achieve. I'm a little bit more like 75% story, 25% combat. Some of the players I know are 90% combat, 10% story. Different people, different mixes. I'm really happy about the Game Master who I play with right now because he's kind of like a 50-50 guy. He'll do like 2 or 3 sessions of story, 2 or 3 sessions of combat, 2 or 3 sessions of story, 2 or 3 sessions of combat. And it's very enjoyable playing with him. But if, know your players. It's the biggest part. Know your audience. When you produce media, when you play a game, when you're going to run a game, know your audience. Know who you're playing with. And be flexible. I mean, GMs need to be flexible. It's a part of the skill set. I've gone on a lot of tangents now, and I feel like I've run out of my things to say. So I'm going to stop talking now, and I hope to see you next week.